Hey everybody, it's Prince of Queens, and I wanted to give a brief update about that topic I was talking about earlier this month, maybe late November, having to do with the supposed Native American genocide, which was not a genocide. A genocide implies that people rounded up people to kill them, that people had the explicit intention of killing such people that they were targeting. So, the word genocide, in case people don't know its origins, it came into being around World War II to describe what happened to Jewish people in Nazi Germany, as well as being used to describe the Armenian genocide and eventually what happened in Rwanda, where it was two tribes warring with each other. Genocide is basically just a classification that is used to describe what happens when a certain racial, ethnic group, like people with genetic lineage in common, are being targeted by another group of people who just want them dead for the sole purpose of having them dead. They have their reasons for wanting them dead, but the idea is that these people must die because they have this blood in them. So, I was talking to my mother on Christmas about this concept of the genocide of Native American people. And you have to understand, my mother is an old school hippie feminist type person who lives in Seattle. You know, she's over the age of 70. And she grew up in this far leftist Seattle white people type culture where there's a massive amount of white guilt. It is just, white guilt might as well have been invented in Seattle. Now, I'm sure it was probably invented in Berkeley, California, probably really. But, there's probably a direct line from Berkeley to Seattle in terms of thought, in terms of activist, far leftist thought. There's a lot of that type of mentality in Seattle. And my mother was always somebody that was kind of into it, really, to be honest. Now, I don't entirely fault her for this. I think that a number of the things that she thought about in her life were important during the time period in which people were thinking about them. So, she was born in the 40s, and she came of age during the actual civil rights era. And so people had to really consciously think about how they were treating people based on race and that kind of thing. And they did a lot of revolutionary, at least in terms of ideologically revolutionary ways of getting rid of people's inherent bias in terms of how people treated black people and then eventually Native American people. The ideology that used to exist really did actually think of these people as not fully human, and that lasted. And my mother was one of the people that wanted to perpetuate a new culture of people that didn't think that way, right? Well, unfortunately, she bought into a lot of things and didn't really notice when certain people got carried away and were doing simple but diabolical sleights of hand to try to influence people in dishonest and malicious ways. And one of the ways that she fell for, being somebody who was well-intentioned, was that she bought into the book A People's History of the United States of America. I didn't realize this because I've been trash-talking that book a lot in videos, as it was a book that was taught at my high school by a number of Marxist teachers in my high school, and I always thought that it was supposed to be this good book, but I also knew that the kids that were really into it and started being involved in activism because they had read that book and they felt so guilty as white people or whatever, I also knew that they were really stupid. Like, I just knew that they were dumb people. So I never actually read the book, but I assumed that it was, sort of accurate. It was a big part of my life, culturally, is what I will say. And, one of the things that was said in the book was that the Native Americans were the victims of a genocide, and that white settlers deliberately infected them with diseases. Not only were there wars, but the settlers were giving them blankets with smallpox in them, and that's how the diseases were spread. They weren't spread naturally. It was very deliberate and blah, 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 blah. Well, I've been talking about that a lot in videos because I've discovered that this book was written by a communist who just totally did everything he could to revise history in a really deceptive way. And turns out that the Native American genocide thing is not really true. Now, keep in mind, this book came out 2 years before I was born. I was born in 82. This book came out in 1980. And so this mentality of trying to foster all of the white guilt and white people repenting for their sins and coming up with a multicultural, multi-ethnic, multi-racial civilization in the United States, that had been around since really probably the 60s when that really got popular. And so, give or take, I would say, let's say 15 years was when that stuff had been around. And so I guess my mother bought into that book. And so we had to have the conversation where I was like, Mom, so do you know that book just really lies a lot? I had already mentioned to her at one point that it is written by a communist, and it fails to mention that Cuba, which is now a communist nation, imported over twice as many slaves to it as continental United States, and yet nobody in that book, the author in that book, never mentions that. He doesn't mention the fact that Cuba is this, by his standards, built on a legacy of slavery, right? I mentioned that to my mother and how that's weird, but she didn't think that was irrefutable proof that this is a non-reputable book. She just thought that was kind of strange, but she insisted that it's a good book. So I said to her over Christmas, I was like, Mom, did you know that he's also lying about Native American genocide? And she was like, why? And I'm like, well, so here's the thing about the smallpox blankets. And I told this story. You can listen to my other video about it and look at the source that I cited, which is really good. Ultimately, it's a tragedy what happened to the Native Americans, and there were a number of things that happened which were somewhat debatable. There was an attempt to infect Native Americans with smallpox from blankets, but it almost certainly didn't actually work. And even if it did work, it was only like 60 people actually died that winter of the smallpox outbreak that happened. So that's by no means most of the deaths from diseases. That was only documented one time, but it's almost certain that they didn't actually get smallpox from the blankets because they also kidnapped and murdered a bunch of people and stole all their stuff, and so they probably got it from doing that. But there were a few other, confusing things like that. Eventually, the settlers decided to put Native Americans in reservations and give them houses, which they thought were going to be an upgrade for them. They thought that was going to be better living quarters, a better living situation. But it turned out that because they don't have immunity to airborne viruses, it made them extremely susceptible to whooping cough and pneumonia. And so a bunch of them died, like a massive quantity of them died. And they knew that it was because of the houses, because they were used to living in teepees. Teepees are better ventilated. And so, yeah, that's a tragedy, but it's not deliberate. So I explained that to my mom, and she's like, well, I don't know, Prince. I mean, the genocide, you can't argue with the undeniable long-term effects of the way that the Europeans treated these people and how many of them died. And I was like, Mom, it's not genocide. They didn't mean to. And she's like, well, but it still happened. And then finally I figured out the solution. And I said, Mom, think about this from my perspective. This book, A People's History of the United States, it came out 2 years before I was born. And I always believed the information that was in it. I always heard about these things, and I believed as a white person that white people committed genocide against these people, that it was deliberate. And I just learned that this was not deliberate. Can you imagine how much of a difference that means to me in my head? And she accepted the fact that this was a pretty messed up thing, that I lived my whole life thinking so poorly of not my ancestors, because my ancestors weren't settlers, but just, like, I was still getting all of the white guilt stuff. I was still being told that I was privileged and that the genocide benefited me and blah, 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 blah. Well, to find out that this alleged genocide didn't even exist, that obviously was a thing. And she admitted, like, when she was trusting of the author of the book and people like that author, she didn't pay attention to the notion that it would lead to her children being lied to in a way that would, I guess, I hate saying this, but damage them psychologically. And learning that did actually make a difference to her. So I would say that if anybody is in a similar situation where they have parents that are leftists and, have all this white guilt and things like that, or, or if your family's black and, your parents, I don't know, just are insistent that all these horrible things happened, you can tell them that you learned that these things weren't necessarily true. Some of them were true, but you learned that some untrue things were said by leftists that dramatically influenced the way that you saw the world since birth. And it made you feel sad and hopeless and as if the world was unfair. And you learned that these things are untrue and now you feel better. And let your parents know that, because apparently it actually makes a difference. At least in my case. Alright. I will be scripting a video very soon. Have a good one.